We're now at the point where I will help you to understand the areas where we would like to do some discussion of world cultures and values and all of that process. Today on our 10th week of class, we're going to be talking in our world cultures class about the reality of living in a time when we are seeing the world shift from a modern to a postmodern, and then from there move into the future. Now, postmodernism has largely deconstructed modernism as an overriding theory for culture, and those who would call themselves modernists are shrinking in number and in influence as well. Few people today are willing to say, I have the absolute truth, that I've learned that from my scientific research. And most people realize that what they have is an understanding of the world from their background, from what they have been taught, from things of that nature. And that there are other people out there that have a different understanding of the world, and you have to accept that as having value and legitimacy. This has led to a reconceptualization of the manner in which we understand the sciences. At one time, a person would say, "This is scientific," and that meant it was absolute gospel truth to them. They left no room for any other point of view. And if you had another point of view, they'd look at you askance and say, that guy's not very smart, or that young lady's, close-minded, or something of that nature. And they would put down the person who did not accept their understanding of truth. But with postmodernism, there is that realization that you simply cannot know all things. And so once you claim to do that, what you have done is placed yourself into a position of bigoted self-interest. Globalization has transformed the world in many ways, and it has affected the worldview, especially the traditional worldviews of many people. In fact, there are very few people in the world that have not been affected in some way, shape, or form by modernity and globalization. Because you see, through the mass media that now reaches almost everywhere, people have some access to the world at large. Even the most remote individuals will often travel into the village or to the city for some purpose, whether it be government paperwork or business or whatever. And when they're there, they're going to see the advertising, they're going to see the glitzy billboards, they're going to be exposed to cell phones, to the internet, to things like that, and they will be drawn to it. And they will very quickly begin to experiment with and make use of that mass media. Now, this has meant that peoples everywhere are increasingly aware of the world at large, about the way other people do things, how they dress, how they act, how they speak, what they eat, where they go, what they do for entertainment, and things of that nature. This has produced many positive changes, to be sure. It has given many people access to at least some forms of education, some forms of communication, maybe to some sorts of help programs that might make their lives better. It has also stimulated a resurgence of local nationalism and religious identities, sort of a reaction to this transformation of the traditional, of the norm. Remember, I said early on in this class that worldview is often a keeper of tradition, and so worldview in and of itself is often somewhat resistant to these new changes. While it's always an organic entity that is perpetually in a state of flux and change, it serves to limit or to slow down the velocity of that change. And so this has produced many people who do not want to see these changes take place. And so they tout their nationalism and their local religious identity as paramount, and they attempt to encourage others to follow them in that process. Now, this has opened many doors. It has also created many difficulties in these traditional societies. Some have transformed themselves in a massive manner, and others have resisted in significant ways and even proposed a closing or a backlash to modernity and to the influences of external individuals. We can see that, for example, in a resurgent Hindu nationalism and in Arab Islamic radicalization. Now, this particular reality has produced its own cognitive themes as well. As we've moved through modernity to post-modernity, and we looked at cognitive themes in each one of those particular areas or genres of knowledge, when we come to this particular moment, we have to consider the cognitive themes that are critical, the ones that are being discussed, the ones that are being taught, the ones that are being pushed upon students and upon the new cultures into which these influences begin to penetrate. The cognitive themes that would be very typical of this globalization and resurgent localization would be things like the resurgence of global values and local values at the same time. As these global values once again take on new importance because they're reaching out and spreading the commercialization, and people are trying to sell their products and their services, at the same time local values are often resurgent as well, and this brings about a dynamic tension between the two. Globalization has fractured as regional emerging powers now assert their cultural and commercial influence, and we certainly see this in the case of both China and India in Asia. Those countries which were once considered merely consumers of Western goods, products, and services are now not only continuing to consume, but many times they've developed their own industries that are moving forward as well. And with that, as they export their own produced and manufactured goods, they're also exporting the individuals that will establish the businesses in other countries, the commercial entities, the marketing programs. They are also spreading what has been some of their traditional cultural values as well, and sometimes doing that in a rather militant form. Now, as these commercial interests that are now becoming global in their outlook seek to penetrate these new markets, they often have to adapt to local realities and local values in an effort to sell their product. We mentioned the idea of McDonald's trying to sell hamburgers in a largely Hindu section of Colombia. It ain't going to happen, as they say. And so as a result, if they want to penetrate those markets, they have to adapt their product to that region and to the values of those people. And this adaptation has sort of backwards cross-pollination as well, as sometimes those new products and those new adaptations appear to be attractive to people in maybe the home country or in some other markets where they work. Academia has also been a major player in this process, as many of the elite and wealthy in other countries value Western education so highly that they will pay, and that they can pay, for sending their children to the West for an education. You cannot study in any American university without finding students and other individuals who've come from other countries and have been in some way sponsored in that project. And the ideal is that they will absorb these values that academia sees as positive and take them back home with them and be a positive influence in their country. Now, sometimes that is secularization and commercialization. In our case, we would hope that it would be a sharing of the saving knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now, these resurgent traditional and religious values are exerting a renewed influence both in the local and in the world stage, because these individuals become gatekeepers to the local populations. In other words, if I would want to enter a country like perhaps India or China, or even more so Afghanistan or one of those Islamic nations, if I did not have the sponsorship and the protection of some of these local influential people, it simply could not be done. In order to gain that acceptance and protection, I would have to in some way provide for those individuals something that they want, something that they are willing to provide that protection and introduction for. Now, sometimes that's commercialization, sometimes it might be a religious value, and sometimes it is simply a way of engendering or cultivating their own power and influence in their region, and they're willing to do what it takes to do that. World bodies such as the United Nations and World Bank are also powerful forces and influence, and they often use their influence and economic power to dictate courses of action. We've seen that as the World Bank, for example, has demanded that certain countries adapt their local economy to what they consider to be the necessary mechanisms for correcting some sort of imbalance or economic difficulty that that country finds itself in. And in doing so, they exert the influence of their worldview, of their philosophy, of their particular academic and economic and even religious beliefs. One thing that has affected this greatly has been the mass migrations, the mass media, and mass travel. We live in a time of unprecedented voluntary and forced migrations. Many business executives and technocrats travel the world, and they live in many different countries for extended periods of time as they practice their business activity. University professors influence the children of the elite and the wealthy from other countries, and many professors often will go to a foreign country and teach for a year or two or three as a way of embellishing their own curriculum vitae or their own professional imagery. Where international travel was once the exotic privilege of the few, of the wealthy, of the elite, of the famous, of the powerful, today vast numbers of individuals from middle-class families travel the globe for tourism, for religious purposes and short-term mission, and for study. In doing that, they are influenced by what they see and what they understand in the culture around them, and they bring back some of those values and understandings to the world from which they've come. This has significant meaning for personal identity. Few individuals are now totally formed by their clan, village, or tribe, and the mass media injects values and lifestyles of others into the local understanding of this meaning of life. Virtually everyone has some relative now that lives in a distant land and comes home with exotic gifts and fascinating tales of life in a different country. And this creates a somewhat schizophrenic worldview where multiple identities compete for the loyalty and attention of the individual as they develop their own constantly changing and renewed worldview. This means that we live in a strange new world. This means that none of us can totally claim an absence of foreign influence in our lives, in our values, in our culture, and in our worldview. It means that we are affected by the other, and that this other, the culturally different from us, will affect us just as we affect them. Now, we can be either a force for good, or we will continue what has often been an exploitative model which contributes to the suffering of vast numbers of marginal people. And it's there that Christ and our Christian values can enable us to be agents for positive change and transformation for the good in a world that has seen far too much suffering.